Good morning. God bless you. A special word of welcome to everybody at the Ascent and all those that are going to be part of the launch team at Clemens. God bless you. And a special word of welcome to everybody at the Union Cross campus and everyone else who comes under the sound of my voice. Are you ready for some good news? You can, by the grace of God, by the power of the Holy Spirit Himself, you can know, not just know about, but know the hope to which you've been called. You can know what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints, and you can know what is the immeasurable greatness of His power that is at work in you, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. You can know these things. And this is what Paul prayed for the Ephesians. We're in Ephesians chapter 1, and this is part of our series where we're learning about 5 great prayers from the Bible that you can know and you can pray every day. It's part of your prayer life. And if there were just, I don't know, if there were one prayer maybe that I would just say, I would start with learning and praying regularly, it'd probably be this Ephesians 1 prayer. And we start at verse 16 of Ephesians chapter 1. This is Paul writing, I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of Him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you, what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of His power toward us who believe, according to the working of His great might that He worked in Christ when He raised Him from the dead and seated Him at His right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. So you can pray this for others. You can pray this for yourself. You put someone's name in there, put your own name in there, put your family in there, and pray exactly as Paul has prayed for the eyes of your own heart and others to be enlightened and to know what is the hope to which you've been called, and what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurably great power that God has at work in and toward and through you. There was a wonderful prayer gathering in our city this week. Several different groups sponsored it and just filled up the convention center downtown early morning on Tuesday. And a man named Pete Greig, who is a pastor and author and known as the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement that has taken off all over the world, that really much of which began with a movement in his own small congregation outside of London. And now there are estimated to be millions of people that are participating in 10,000 different locations where there are people that are praying in rooms 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And Pete, it was one of the greatest talks on prayer I've ever heard. And in the midst of it, he said that what happened when just a few people began praying around the clock in their church. And he said, and we began to see miracles. And he described some of them, a boy that was healed of leukemia. And he began describing some of these miracles. And it was so funny. Pete Greig, he said, I went to some of my parishioners and we started seeing all these miracles. I said, this is so exciting because this means that Christianity is true. They all came there and said, but Pastor, you're the pastor. You're supposed to believe it's true. He said, yeah, all the more reason. It's important for me to know that it's really true. And I laughed because I knew what he meant. He already believed it was true, but when he was experiencing the book of Acts, he was saying, I know that it is true. And there is a difference between intellectual assent to something and the actual heart knowledge of something. And this prayer of Paul's is really a prayer about knowing, about what you know. Paul had been shipwrecked and snake-bitten and flogged and beaten and imprisoned, and he loved God and he had joy in his life. He had experienced Jesus with such intimacy that his revelations were so high and so lofty that this was part of the reason that God would not take the so-called thorn out of his side, which was really to say, I'm not going to allow you to have freedom from the same kind of spiritual battles that other people face, because Paul said, I needed to remain humble because I've had such extraordinary revelations of God. He had been nearly raptured because of the extravagance of the revelation that he had with God. Paul had had so many miracles take place through him. This is Paul. And I say all that because we should pay attention to what Paul prays. And this is what Paul prayed for the Ephesians, and this is what Paul prays for you and me, that you will really know the hope that you've been called toward, the true hope that is in your calling, and that you would know what are the riches in this glorious inheritance in the saints, and that you would know this incomparably great power that is at work, the same resurrection power that raised Jesus at work in you. That's what he's praying, that we would really, really know. And so let's talk about this. And first, the idea of knowing is so important, beloved. In fact, that's the essence of the prayer. The hope of our calling, the inheritance of the saints, and then power of God. These are realities. What the prayer is, that you would know these things. Not just to know about them, but to really know them. There are two vastly divergent schools of thought when it comes to the notion of knowing the love and the goodness of God. And they might seem subtle at times in the way you hear them, but they are truly divergent thoughts. And very important that we get this straight, because one leads to life and the other really leads towards destruction. It's the difference in law and grace, but it's quite evident the way you'll hear the message preached. And one says, we better not let people believe 100% fully that they can absolutely know that they are saved and know that they're going to heaven and know that they'll never be dismissed by God. Because if we keep that a little uncertain, then people will strive harder to live a holy life. But the other perspective, which most assuredly is the gospel perspective, is that you would know for sure that you are saved, know for sure that you are loved, know for sure that you're accepted in the beloved, and nothing could ever separate you. This huge divergence of mentality plays itself out not only in the way the message of the gospel is proclaimed, but in the way that we live our lives. Parent A might have the opinion, I don't want to tell Junior just how wonderful he is and how much accepted he is no matter what he does, because then he might get lazy, or he might not try, or he might not be obedient. Whereas Parent B says, no, I want to have my child know how thoroughly he's accepted in this family and in my love, and that nothing could ever change my love, because it'll build confidence into the child. And these are completely divergent ways of living your life, ways of parenting, ways of interacting with others. And it's so fundamental and it is so essential that you must think of this like a watershed, like if there's some continental divide and everything it's up towards the top, it might look very close to one another that you couldn't even distinguish the difference. But let it run all the way to the Pacific Ocean or all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and then you'll see the difference. And I think it's very important to do this when you think of law and grace. And when you think of matters like this, are we supposed to know that we know that we know? Or are we supposed to be left a little bit uncertainty so that we'll try harder? And it's very, very important. You see, under the law, there really is no other way except to live with a sense of uncertainty, because it is conditional. There's a very famous rabbi in the first century. He was known as Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And when he was known as the Hammer and the Light of Israel, a very, very important rabbi. And when he fell ill, some of his disciples came to him, and when he saw them that night, he began to weep. And his disciples said, Light of Israel, this is recorded in a well-known writing, Light of Israel, right-hand pillar, mighty hammer, why do you weep? And he said to them, were I being led before a mortal king, I would weep. Now that I am being led before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. And he continued, moreover, 2 paths are before me, one to Eden and the other to Gehenna. And I do not know upon which I am being led. Shall I not weep? See, he was one of the most prominent rabbis of their day. But he was saying, as I near my death, I can't be able to say for certain if I'm being led into paradise or into the infernal dump, the garbage heap, the darkest valley. And the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Kittle has this quote in reference to the mentalities of the law that was reflected in that time. There is perhaps no more striking proof of this than in the fact that the schools of Hillel and Shammai, 2 primary rabbinical schools, disputed for more than 2 years whether it were better for man not to have been created or whether it is good for him to have been created, based on not being able to be certain about if you spend eternity with God. And they finally agreed it were better for him not to have been created. And Kittle's dictionary says, if you really think of it, no other view is really possible under the law, if you see things carried out to their extreme. And so it is that Paul is saying that you would know not just your salvation, but everything that is included in what it means to be a child of God. That you would absolutely know this. Not that you would just know it theoretically or intellectually. Do you know what the difference is? As we say knowing it by heart. When we say know something by heart, we mean not just that you've memorized it, but it has just become part of you so you don't have to think about it anymore. I think that's what Paul is praying. Some years ago, my daughter Abby and I were able to go on a mission trip to Papua New Guinea. And en route, we were able to spend a few days in Australia. And while there, to do some sightseeing, we rented a car. And I did so with much fear and trepidation because I had never driven on the left side of the road before. We literally got into the rental car and I drove it around the parking lot at the airport for a while just to try to get myself acclimated. I knew I was supposed to drive on the left-hand side of the road. I know that in Australia you drive on the left-hand side of the road. So I knew it, but I didn't know it. And it was pretty scary, actually, the whole time that I drove the car over that period of days. And I just said, Abby, your job is, she wasn't even old enough to have her driver's license, but I said, your job is just sit there and just keep reminding me, stay on the left side, Daddy. Stay on the left side, Daddy. And almost every intersection that we came to in Australia was a roundabout. They love their roundabouts. And it's already confusing to go in a roundabout, even if you're used to roundabouts and you're driving in your home country. But on the left-hand side of the road with these 2-laned roundabouts and cars coming in from all the way, it was so harrowing. I said, Abby, we can't turn the radio on. We cannot talk. You just sit there and remind me to stay to the left. And if I start going on the wrong side of the road, you tell me that I did. And there were a couple of times that I got on the wrong side of the road, and it was not a fun sight. But I just had to concentrate the whole time because what I'm saying is I knew drive on the left-hand side of the road, but I didn't know it. But I came back home, I got in my car, and I drive, and I don't have to tell myself, oh, drive on the right-hand side of the road. And in fact, you get in, you listen to the radio, talk to someone in the car with you, you're driving along, everything is by instinct. I think this is part of what Paul is praying, is that you would know. Have the eyes of your heart enlightened. When he says that you would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, the Spirit is not referenced here, not the Holy Spirit, but your own redeemed, born-again spirit alive unto God. That you would live in such a way that there is a grace that's operating in you so that your eyes of your heart, that inmost part of your being, that you spiritually see these things. when you say to see something or be enlightened, it means that it's not theoretical to you, but you're able to see experientially these things. And therefore you live with a spirit of wisdom and revelation. That there's wisdom that's coming from God's Spirit and revelation that's coming from God's Spirit, so that you see these things and that you know these things. That's what he's praying. It's about a knowledge. And the first thing that he's praying that you would know for sure is the hope to which he has called you. There is a relationship between hope and calling. Hope biblically is not wishful thinking. It is not the child who a month before Christmas says, I wish that I would get a pony for Christmas. If a child says, I hope I get a pony, but the child's not going to get a pony, that's just wishful thinking. No, hope is not wishful thinking. Hope is an inward state of delight, the soul's bliss, at the certainty of blessedness that most assuredly is coming. So the child that's excited before Christmas, and you say, why are you excited? And the child says, because Christmas is coming. And the child sees Christmas presents under the tree and knows that there's something good that is coming. That joy, that delight, that peace, that enthusiasm, that mode of living, that's what hope is. That's what hope is. So it's not wishful thinking. It is more of something that is rooted in a deep assurance. And what Paul is saying here in the prayer is that the hope that you have is intimately related to a calling. And to have a hope to which you've been called is to say exactly the opposite of the spirit of this age. Because our current culture in America is much more inclined to say, if you want to have hope, then look deep inside of yourself, find that inner place of goodness within you, or find that inner guide, or whatever it might be, and there'll be the substance of your hope. But what the Bible teaches is exactly opposite of that. If you just look within yourself, you're not going to find answers. But instead, that the real hope of your life is to do with something outside of you calling you. That the image of hope for the Christian is one of being called by God, of hearing God, a voice outside of your own voice, who has wisdom and who has love and who has direction, who has assurance, who has power, who is the one who is able to instill that hope because you have been called. And you see, the call of God is a call that when He speaks it, it has its effect. His call is in and of itself so beautiful and so glorious and so authoritative that it actually brings forth a response. This is the thing that's so wonderful about being called of God. Is it's not just like God giving you some sort of little set of instructions and then you go follow it. It's more like the voice is leading you. And this is the call of God in our lives. I know I've probably told this before, but many years ago, I was at church and I got a phone call. My daughter, Abby, who was young at the time, and she was frantic on the other end of the phone. And she said, Daddy, come home. She said, it was terrible. It's terrible. Reese, our beagle, is in the backyard and he's cornered with a possum. And the possum is hissing. And about that, I'm afraid Reese is going to get really hurt. The possum is right there. And we can't get Reese out. And I said, I'll be right there. And so I got home and I said, the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to take the hose and we're going to splatter these animals with the hose and try to break up this beagle possum fight. And because our beagle, he's a little fella and he always thought he was tougher. I mean, I know how you've heard stories about possums and what they can do when they're not playing dead. They go all out, and I didn't want my dog coming out of there all scratched and bloody and everything. So I tried hosing him. Nothing happened. And everybody had been there. They've been all night trying to call him out of there. And so finally, I just walked over and I said, Reese, come here. Come. And that beagle came walking out of the bushes right over to me, and I grabbed him by the collar and saved the day. And I just, as I walked off with Reese as the hero that I was, and I just looked at the rest of the family and I said, this proves I am the alpha dog. And I had called the dog, and the call had an effect. Think of a better example. Jesus stood outside the tomb of Lazarus and said, Lazarus, come out. The call had resurrection power in it. You could say, well, you can resist the call of God, but I would say, are you sure? I mean, the Apostle Paul, he began his journey by getting overwhelmed by the glory of God, blinded and led around by the hand in Damascus for 3 days. I guess he could have denied all of that, but how could he? You could say Jonah could have resisted the call of God, but he tried to flee to Tarshish, and he got swallowed up by a whale. God wasn't going to let him die. It spit him out on the shore and told him to go and preach to Nineveh like he had told him to. I guess he could resist, but really? In other words, there is so much goodness in the heart of God that he calls us to a hope. And Paul is praying that powerful, effective call of God is allowing you to, in your spirit, know every day hope. It's what this generation needs. It's what the whole world needs. Hope. And we wonder why there's so much hopelessness. Wherever there's godlessness, there's going to be hopelessness if we are here by cosmic accident, having become highly evolved creatures originating from primordial sludge. What hope is there? But if there's a design on your life, if there's a purpose for which you have been made, then every day is filled with hope. Called you. And the second part of the prayer, to know what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints. The glorious inheritance and the riches of it. He's speaking of the spiritual riches of knowing yourself to be a child of God. The story of the Scripture is a story of a movement of a people who were slaves, who are not just set free, but who become heirs. And if you only talk about being set free from slavery, you're only talking about the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that they were to inherit a land. And to know themselves to not only be free is only part of the journey. To know themselves to be heirs is essential. And so the whole story of the Old Testament was about a people who at first couldn't believe that they were heirs, so they didn't take the promised land. So part of what Paul is praying here is that you would know that you have made a move not just out of the darkness into the light, not just out of being like a slave spiritually, to being free, but to know the riches of this glorious inheritance. As I've written about before, my cousin Jan adopted a little girl from Russia many years ago. That little girl, Sasha, she's going to be heading off to college next year. Now she's just a beautiful young lady. But I'll never forget when we first had her over to our house as a 3-year-old, and we had little Abby there, and they were going to, 3 or 4 years old, they're going to go and play in the backyard. And Sasha didn't speak any English, and we had bought her some presents. And so we gave her these presents, and she didn't know what to do. She'd never opened a present. She didn't know how to open a present. So Abby was over there trying to help her open the present, showed her how to open it, so she opened it. And then we had a little present, a little doll baby or something like that. And Abby went to try to show her how to play with this or what this baby would do. And Sasha grabbed it and pulled it back like this. And my cousin explained at the orphanage, they didn't have any of their own toys. Everything was just held in common. And so when she got something that was actually hers, she's too afraid. She had to just hold on like this. And they went in the backyard and they played. And for the first time, this little girl got to swing on a swing set. And they played in a sandbox. And they ran around this backyard. And it came time to leave. And my cousin couldn't get Sasha to go to the car. And nobody could speak any Russian. And Sasha didn't know what we were saying. All she saw was she was going to leave this backyard with all this fun and go get in this car. And I asked my cousin Jan, I said, what's going on? She said, well, I think it's this simple. This is the best time she's ever had in her whole life. And I don't have any way to explain to her that this is the way it's going to be from now on. As far as she knows, she'll never be able to come back here. And so we had no way to lead her. Because if all you've known is being an orphan, you got to hold on to everything. And so growing up meant to not just discover that I'm no longer an orphan, but is to realize I'm an heir. And so Sasha was over on Easter Day, and we played cornhole in the backyard, and my wife had prepared all the cousins. Even though they're all older now, they still have a big Easter basket full of all kinds of Easters. It's like Christmas at my house. And when we came by the time to say bye to Sasha, I gave her a hug and said, see you soon. And she didn't cry and resist getting in the car because she knew this is her life. Paul's saying, I want you to know, and so this is my prayer, what are the glorious riches, these riches that are part of the glorious inheritance in the saints. The picture of adoption in the Bible is one that would be very familiar in the Roman culture. This is why in Romans 8, when Paul said, you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but receive the spirit of adoption as sons, he had a very specific image in mind. Children in Roman society were important because that was the means by which the father passed on the inheritance. And therefore, oftentimes, there would be an adoption for the purpose of the father having someone to pass along the family inheritance. And every now and then, there would be a father who would adopt a slave. And this is the actual reference that is the backdrop of what it means to be adopted, a slave. Justinian in his Institute outlines the process. It was called adrogation, from the Latin word for ask, rogatur. And because the legal process, the father was asked if he desired that the person he was going to adopt be his lawful son. So once you're asked that, then the adoption process begins. Do you want this to be your legal son? The adrogatus, the one being adopted, came into the power of the adrogator, the one who was adopting. The property of the one being adopted came into the ownership of the adoptive father. But the debts of the one adopted and personal servitude was utterly extinguished. There's no more debt and no more sense of servitude. In other words, no matter how much the debt the slave had, it was all canceled because of this new legal status. And the one adopted would lose all rights in his old family, but gained all the rights of a fully legitimate son. So literally, it meant getting a new father. And though a father could estrange or disown a biological son, according to Roman law, it was unlawful to ever estrange or disown an adopted son. Your inheritance is in him. Psalm 73 says of the Lord, He's my portion. And there's probably a priest who is praying and saying, I didn't get a portion of land, but God's my portion. And if you really want to understand what are the riches of the glorious inheritance in Him, you understand it's in Him. He Himself, God, is your inheritance. He's not just your provider. He is your provision. He's not just your supplier. He is your supply. He's not just the giver of bread. He is your bread. He's not just the giver of water. He is your living water. He's not just your physician. He is your healing. He's not just the dispenser of blessings. He is the blessing. He's not just the giver of affection. God is love. He is not just pointing the way. He is the way. He doesn't just teach you the truth. He is the truth. He doesn't just add to your life. He is your life. And inasmuch as you know yourself to be an heir, it will change every aspect of the course of your life. I really think that a student who studies and applies him or herself to strive to make A's does so in the best environment, because that student has developed a consciousness. I see myself as an A student. And I think this is the way that God has designed for us to live out of that inheritance. Scholars actually have written much about exactly how we should read this phrase, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance, because the language here is very similar to language that is used often in the Old Testament to speak of the inheritance of God. Not just the inheritance we have in God, but of God's own inheritance, and that is his people. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 20, "But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are his this day." So that there's a beautiful picture in the Bible that you are God's inheritance. He redeemed you, and he treasures you. That you would know not only what God has provided for you by way of inheritance, but that you are God's own possession, his inheritance. It changes everything in your life. And it is amongst the saints. It is amongst the holy ones. When you pray this, and you pray it over your life, you pray it over others, you're partly praying that you would know that you're a holy one. That the inheritance that you're sharing in is amongst those that are set apart unto God. And then the third part of this, the immeasurable greatness of his power. Paul here stacks up, it's like he just reaches out and grabs all these words for greatness and power and stacks them up with one another. This idea of immeasurable is from, I'm going to give you some Greek words here because you're going to recognize them. It's from the word hyperbalo, or in its noun form, hyperbole. You know this word, hyperbole. Hyper means above, beyond, and balo actually meant to throw. This word actually means to throw beyond, and that's where it got into the idea of excess. It is like it's beyond. Hyperbole. And the word for greatness, megathos, and you hear this all the time, mega. Anything that we talk great, mega. It's hyperbole, megathos. Of his power is dunamis, and you know the word dynamite. It's hyperbole, mega, dynamite. And the next word about the working of God is energeo, energy. It's the word energy. And kratos, his might, you see this appearing in the words like aristocrat, kratos, or it means rule. It means power. And the final word, ischus, strength, capacity, which actually comes from a verb that means to hold. And it really is about the power of God to hold on to you. So Paul's just piling all these words up here of his immeasurable greatness of power working in you, his mighty strength, and references this as the same power that raised the Lord Jesus from the dead. And the language here really means it is usward. Some translations say toward you or toward us, or some say in us or through us. It really means all of that. This great power is at work usward. It is toward us, oriented towards us, but it is in us and it is through us. It is that Paul is praying that you would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation in your human spirit, so that you would be able to know experientially the power of God. And not have it such that there's something inside of you that becomes so afraid of the voice of God or the power of God or the presence of God that somehow you shut that off. We have at our house, in our family room, a wonderful surround sound for our TV that I personally installed. And that seems to be the problem. I installed it. And it sounds wonderful most of the time, except as soon as I got it installed, we realized there was a problem because we popped in some DVD or something that had great surround sound and big explosions. And as soon as it got to this big exciting moment, and it was building up to this crescendo, and it got kind of loud, the receiver, the amplifier, it just shuts off. And we're like, oh no. And I started reading about it, and I realized it has something to do with the ohms. I don't know what that is. It has something to do with the capacity of the system. I don't know what it is. But to protect itself from just blowing all the speakers up, I guess, it gets to certain frequencies, and it just shuts off. And it's such a pain. We sit there, it just happens like that. You get some exciting set, shuts off. Oh, there it was, shuts off. We have to cut the thing back on and kind of rewind and look where we were. And as Bennett said very well, once we installed this, he said rats. He said, because those big exciting moments are that's the most fun reason to have a surround sound, and we have to shut it off. And I was just thinking, this is sort of what I think Paul's praying, is that when the wonders of God and the goodness of God and His power that is at work and His healing mercies and the sound of His voice and the direction and call in your life and everything that's so wonderful about God, when He comes close, when He comes near, that you don't shut off for a fear of not being able to have the capacity. It's a prayer that you would have a capacity to be able to experience the resurrection power of God in every arena of your life, and to be a vessel through which God's power flows. Oh, that you would know, not just theoretically or intellectually, the hope to which you have been called. What are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the holy ones, and the immeasurable greatness of His power that is at work in you. That's Paul's prayer. And if Paul prayed it, you can pray it. And if we're called to pray it, it must all be possible. And that's the gospel.